We're back now with David Ignatius of the Washington Post and CBS News National Security correspondent David Martin. Over at the White House this morning, our chief White House correspondent, Major Garrett. Major, you did considerable reporting yesterday on the president's phone call to Putin. You said officials were telling you this was the toughest phone call of his administration. What are they thinking about over there this morning? What do they see as what might happen here?
Well, Bob, the White House knows that Putin has the facts on the ground. He has a military force in the Crimea. What the United States and its European partners have is international law, international norms, and the threat of pronounced economic isolation for Russia if it continues with what Secretary of State Kerry just called a brazen breach of international law. Now, the reason the administration uses that phraseology is because that's what Vladimir Putin conspicuously and constantly talks about in other parts of the world. Syria, Iran, it's always talking about other nations, specifically the United States, following international norms. Well, the United States is now calling Russia out on its behavior, saying you're violating the self-same standards you constantly seek to hold the rest of the world to. And if you continue with this behavior, you're going to be isolated not only diplomatically, but economically. And right now the administration is working behind the scenes to have this IMF team, International Monetary Fund team, that's due to arrive in Kiev later this week, not just come there to say hello, but have a specific aid package for the Ukrainians to say the West is here to help you economically. And as it has with the situation in Crimea, the administration will invite the Russians in. Look, participate internationally if you have legitimate concerns about the Russians in Crimea. But if you don't, your isolation, economically and diplomatically, will only increase, and the White House believes that is a greater force of leverage than they believe Putin has, even though he has the forces on the ground in Crimea.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Major. David, what's happening militarily? I don't think anybody, as I said to Secretary Kerry, and he didn't dispute this, nobody's saying about going to war with Russia right now. Is there any kind of military movement in that part of the world right now? Ships or anything like that?
Not on the part of the United States. The only movement right now is Russian troops continue to flow into Crimea. It's hard to put a number on it, but whatever the number, it's a fait accompli. And you notice that Secretary Kerry said, if this stands. He did not say, this shall not stand, as George H.W. Bush once said of the invasion of Kuwait. The U.S. has no military options. It has no treaty obligations to come to the defense of Ukraine. Putin knows that, and that is why he has acted so decisively. The big question is whether he is going to order Russian troops into the rest of Ukraine. That would turn what is now a crisis into, I think, a full-scale disaster.
Well, explain to us exactly what's happened here. The Russians have a base. They have a military base in Crimea. There are Russian troops there already. Apparently, some of them have moved outside of the base now, but they haven't moved beyond the borders of Crimea. That's
right. They haven't crossed over where Liz Palmer was standing into the rest of Ukraine. And this morning's intelligence is that there is no sign that they are preparing to do that, which is, in the context of everything else that's happened, very good news.
So, David, how do you assess what's happened so far, and what happens now?
Well, I think we saw the parameters of U.S. policy in the interviews with Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel. Secretary Kerry used very strong language, brazen act of aggression, violation of international law. He called on the Russians to roll back this invasion. But when you got down to the specific tools, the ways in which the United States will make Russia pay a cost for what it's done, these are milder diplomatic options. As David said, I'm told by my sources in the Pentagon, there is no ship moving in the Mediterranean. There are no NATO troops moving on the landmass of Europe. We are not preparing for a military response. If you're talking about rollback, you're talking about Putin realizing that this course, which reanimates Cold War psychology in Eastern Europe, is not in his interest. And I do think the final point to add here is the real problem today is Vladimir Putin's. Vladimir Putin has a Ukraine that is coming apart. He has invaded a small southern piece of it where Russian interests are very strong, But in the Ukrainian capital, you have demonstrators in the streets. These are demonstrators who evicted a pro-Russian regime in the Ukraine, and they're not prepared to go backwards. So the choices Putin faces going forward are very, very bad.
Well, explain to me about the Crimea. It is a part of Ukraine, but someone said to me last night, it's very much like San Diego. You have a large retired military population there, mostly Russians. A lot of the people there speak Russian, and most of the people there are pro-Russian. You heard Liz Palmer say that a lot of these soldiers changed sides here.
Crimea became part of Ukraine only in 1954. Crimea was historically a part of Russia, and Khrushchev, when he was the Soviet leader, gave it to Ukraine in a gesture that mystified some people. But what you say is true. I don't know if it's San Diego, but it is where the Russians have their biggest naval base, where a lot of retirees go. People speak Russian, so it's a part of Ukraine that looks toward Moscow.
Let me stress, I didn't mean that there are a lot of communists in San Diego. I meant there's a large retired military population there, and it's a very, very conservative place. So what happens now, David?
Well, you have this base of the Russians in Crimea, which is a valuable strategic asset for them. This is their way to get out into the Mediterranean, to go to places like Syria. And I don't think they're going to pull out of there until they're satisfied that those bases are secure for the indefinite future.
What does Putin want here?
This action in Crimea and over Ukraine follows a series of efforts by Putin to reestablish, the spirit, if you will, of the Soviet Union, if not the actual physical possession of those republics. I mean, the Sochi Olympics was a kind of exercise in nostalgia for the good old days of Soviet power. And so I think the danger here is if Putin is tempted to think that he can reoccupy countries like Ukraine. He did invade Georgia in 2008. Again, an attempt to assert Russian power in its neighborhood. If he has this romance of bringing things back to the way they used to be, that is trouble. That does take us back to the Cold War.
Well, I'm not sure that he really would take Ukraine back. I mean, this place is an economic basket case. Well, he wants to have influence there. He wants to control events there, but it also carries a pretty good price.
This is not the Soviet military of the Cold War. This is a much reduced and a much weakened military, which in the past, 5 years has been starting to make a comeback. But he's got to be careful about how much he bites off here. I mean, Crimea is one thing. Ukraine would be an entirely different operation.